Hello all, welcome to the launch of the Global Partnership for Responsible Cyber Behavior. I am Louise Marie Urel. I'm a research fellow over at the Royal United Services Institute cyber team, and I'm leading this project and the work of the partnership. It is my pleasure to welcome you all, and first and foremost, and before introducing our excellent lineup of speakers, I think it makes sense to introduce also our initiative, which is supposed to be a shared and co-shared initiative with many other organizations, especially research organizations. So first of all, what is the Global Partnership for Responsible Cyber Behavior and why is it important? The Global Partnership for Responsible Cyber Behavior seeks to map practical understandings of responsibility in cyberspace by conducting evidence-based research and connecting different experts from different sectors and regions to reflect on the diversity of views in these topics. Throughout the next year, more than a year, and probably in the next couple of years, but definitely in the next year and a half, we will be focusing on regional views around responsibility in cyberspace. And this partnership, which is launching today, gathers approximately 70 different scholars from different regions, different research institutions, but also seeks to engage with partners that are from other sectors to bring, let's say, the more evidence-based or practice-based view for us to help us unpack as a research community what are the culturally embedded elements of responsible cyber behavior. So why is this important? As a person that has been following, UN negotiations, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, but not just about that in the next couple of minutes. So for a person that has been following many of these debates, there are various different contentions around thinking about the future of norms in international peace and security, when thinking about responsible state behavior, so looking specifically at that state-centric level, and also to be realistic that, most of the discussions around cybersecurity, and especially when it comes to responsibility at the international level, they are not, let's say, made in a vacuum, so devoid from politizations and geopolitical tensions. So one of the challenges and why this is important is that most of these conversations really revolve around some very key actors, or let's say the big cyber powers, if one can use that terminology, which leaves little understanding or little space for looking at other views and realities when it comes to developing countries. The second point, definitely with regards to how we see or think about responsibility in cyberspace, is that the international peace and security dimension, while important, while a space for consensus building, perhaps misses other less highly politicized or high security dimensions. And another element that we might want to consider, and that is fundamental to thinking about the role of the global partnership, is the need to also, when we think about these international environments, the need to negotiate a consensus document normally flattens what kinds of diverse experience different countries share in that particular room, right, and beyond that room. And finally, in a context where many states cannot speak to each other because of diplomatic kind of tensions and whatnot, that is a space where us as a research community can come together and really have frank conversations about what responsibility means in practice, not necessarily isolated, but definitely engaging with those practitioners. So today I'm really delighted to welcome an incredible set of speakers to join us for this launch that have been working at the international, regional, the private sector, and in academia in these topics for various years. And we have Matthew Wong, which is First Secretary of the Permanent Mission of Singapore to the UN. We also have Alina Noor, who is a Senior Fellow at the Asia Program at Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. We have Carrie Ann Barrett, who is the Cybersecurity Program Manager at the Organization for American States. And we have Jamie Collier, who is a Senior Threat Intelligence Advisor at Mandiant Google. So to kick off our conversation, and I really like to thank all of them and all of you who are here following, be it in the Zoom or on our live stream, for being around and sticking to this conversation. So to kick off our dialogue here, really, I'd like to start with you, Matthew, and potentially do a bounce off of questions here so that we can start from the place that I started to kind of allude to. But you have definitely followed these processes quite closely. So Matthew, could you just start unpacking for us a bit, for those that are not familiar with, let's say, UN-related processes that might have been focusing a little bit more at the national level, but are in other sectors, right? But they're not too familiar with that. So could you reflect on the latest developments, specifically at the UN open-ended working group that just had its, let's say, last rounds of meetings in July, and was up for a very heated conversation. So could you provide us with a status update of those kinds of conversations on responsible state behavior and your perceptions around, let's say, a bit of the future of those conversations now that we have just gone through, let's say, the first, let's say the last round of the second year of that process?
Thank you very much, Louise, and good morning to all distinguished participants from here in New York. I'm very honored to be speaking to all of you today. So first of all, I think I want to begin by thanking Louise and the team at RUSI for organizing this very timely roundtable and for spearheading this initiative as well to bring all of you into this conversation about responsible cyber behavior, which here at the UN, we think this is something that's very, very important to be looking at, a very timely issue. So very happy to set the stage for today's conversation by providing an update and a reflection on the latest developments here at the UN. So first of all, for those of you who aren't familiar with the work of the open-ended working group. The aim of the open-ended working group, as defined in the mandate contained in General Assembly Resolution 75240, is to address issues related to ICT security in the context specifically of international peace and security. So in carrying out its mandate, the current open-ended working group, or the OEWG, builds on more than 20 years of work at the UN in this area, and this work has now collectively constituted a cumulative and evolving framework for responsible state behavior in the use of ICTs. So 2 months ago, against the backdrop of a very challenging geopolitical environment, which I'm sure all of you are very familiar with, the OEWG was once again able to adopt an annual progress report by consensus. So this is the second annual progress report we've adopted in this OEWG by consensus. And the adoption of a very deeply substantive report in such difficult circumstances demonstrates that despite the differences, consensus and progress is still possible as long as states remain committed to working together in a mutually beneficial way on this topic that's of great importance to all states. And to give you a sense of the breadth and depth of the progress that states have made in this second annual progress report, I'd just like to quickly highlight 7 significant outcomes that we've reached across the different pillars of the working group's mandate. So first, states identified a range of existing and potential threats, including emerging threats such as ransomware, which was recognized as a threat for the first time in a consensus report here at the UN. Second, states also agreed to take concrete action on norms implementation, including by requesting for the chair of the open-ended working group to produce an initial draft checklist on the implementation of norms for consideration by states in the coming year. Third, on international law, drawing on the focused discussions that we've been having in the working group over the past year, states agreed on an additional layer of understanding on how international law applies to the use of ICTs, while also continuing to recognize the possibility of the future possible elaboration of additional binding obligations. Fourth, on capacity building, states requested for the chair of the working group to convene a global roundtable on ICT security capacity building. And this is something that will be happening in May next year, and we would be very happy to see all of you participate in this roundtable as well. And also still on capacity building, states also requested that the chair engage with relevant UN entities and international organizations to encourage them to align their capacity building program in support of states' efforts to implement the framework for responsible state behavior. So then that brings together the entire ecosystem that, where a lot is already being done on capacity building and now aligns it with the overall effort that we are moving towards here at the international level. Fifth, on regular institutional dialogue, which is very much the conversation about the future of the conversation, in a sense. States agreed in principle for the first time on a set of common elements that would underpin a future institutional dialogue mechanism. And so this lays the groundwork for further work on this issue over the coming years. And six, with regard to confidence building measures, states agreed for the first time on an initial list of voluntary global CBMs. And so this should provide an impetus for states to start really, redoubling the efforts towards the implementation of CBMs, which is something else that's also, we have many CBMs that's been discussed and contained in reports over the past 10 to 20 years, but now we actually have a very focused list, and is very much something that we hope that states can start very much implementing in earnest. And seventh, and perhaps the most significant step taken in the second annual progress report, is the agreement reached by all states on a set of elements for the development and operationalization of a global points of contact directory. And so now all states will be able to use this points of contact directory to communicate with each other in the event of a cyber incident. And now that these elements have been agreed, the UN Secretariat will begin the work of setting up this directory, and it should be fully functional by 2024. And we'll finally have a directory open to all states at the global level. And this would fulfill an idea and proposal that has been more than 10 years in the making if you go back and look through the previous previous reports in this process. So given the progress that's been made in the second annual progress report, Ambassador Berhan Ghafu of Singapore, in his capacity as chair, his priority over the next year is to ensure that we deliver on the many mandates and deliverables that have been agreed by states in this annual progress report. And this will then contribute to our collective efforts to continue strengthening the cumulative and evolving framework. And over the next year, the chair will also continue to facilitate focused discussions and intersessional meetings to build on the progress that's been made. And the aim is to further develop our common understandings across all 6 areas of the mandate, including on regular institutional dialogue, which I think, as many of you know, has proven to be a particularly challenging area of discussion so far. So at this stage, I would like to thank all of you for your interest in the work of the Open-Ended Working Group. The academic community very much has a crucial role to play in our work, and I hope that you'll be able to join us in actively contributing to this work, and very much look forward to studying and reading the research that you'll be producing under the Global Partnership banner in the months ahead. And very happy to reflect in conversation after this on more specific questions that Louise or that some of you from the floor might have as well. But that's just an overview for now on where we are in the international discussions. Thank you.
That's wonderful, Matthew. And I would like to follow up a bit on some of the points that you raised, right? And having had the opportunity to be in the room in this last round, I think it's interesting to observe the rising tensions towards the end of each, let's say, year of the Open-Ended Working Group, right? So I think there's a question there of what can we realistically expect for this next year in terms of achievables, right? I think there's a lot of different questions popping up with regards to how developing countries normally see us as a win from this process, right? Given that they now have a seat at the table with the OAWG. Also, I think there is another question, which is, and I'd like to hear from you a little bit more. The question of implementation comes back quite frequently, right? And there's also a dispute, let's say geopolitical dispute in the room around whether it should be implementation or new norms. But I wanted to hear from you, what would you say, given all this context and the rising tensions within the negotiations of the OAWG, what can we realistically expect in terms of strengthening and advancing the implementation of the framework for responsible state behavior in the next year, right? I think that's the most immediate timeline. So, and if you could, kind of summarize a bit that in like 1 or 2, actually like 2 to 3 minutes, that would be wonderful.
Thank you very much, Louise. And I think, it's a very good points that you made, and it's been great having you in the room as well. I think we've had a few good conversations. In terms of, I think I'll start with this, in a way, dichotomy between implementation and new norms. And you're very much right to say that for certain groups of countries, the priority or the focus for them is very much saying that it should be on implementation, and for another group of countries, they say no. We need to talk about new norms first. And I think at least from our perspective, in sitting in the in the chair seat, where it's our job to bring these conversations together and try to find a middle way. I don't think these things are mutually exclusive, and if you talk to many of the developing countries, many of the middle ground countries, I think you hear the same thing as well, where the thinking is that these things are not necessarily exclusive, because on the one hand, if you're working on implementation, it's about implementing the existing 11 norms that's been agreed. But as you work on implementing those norms, it also becomes clearer, are these norms enough? Do they cover the situations that we need to cover? Is there more that these norms don't cover? And I think and the countries that are working on implementation, I think you do hear these questions being asked, and people are asking, there's a situation here. Is this something that we can already cover using one of the norms that we have, or should we start thinking about whether actually it may make things clearer for everyone to have this elaborated as a separate norm? And then you also have the question about, in a way, norms elaboration, right? Whether it makes more sense to elaborate the existing norms, or whether it makes sense to, in a sense, have that elaboration as new norms. And I mean, all of these conversations, in a sense, I think everybody is getting at the same thing, which is everybody wants more detail, more guidance on how states can behave responsibly, and everybody wants this agreed by consensus. So if we can, in a way, move beyond the labels and actually think about the substance, which is what we've been trying to encourage in this conversation, I think there's very much potential to sort of bridge that divide. And in terms of what we can expect from the third year of the Open-Ended Working Group, I think very big priority for us would be, in a way, capitalizing and building and fulfilling the potential of the working group, or the ideal of the working group, as this universal conversation and universal process. And it's something that you alluded to at the start, in your introductory remarks also, where you said that in a way, this discussion sometimes is the sort of domain of a few major players. And I think very much what we want is to have that conversation expanded to the vast majority of other countries, especially the developing countries, who are very interested in this. And I think the points of contact directory will be very much a platform for that to happen, because it's the points of contact directory is a directory, but also to be able to nominate a point of contact, you require you require certain structures, you require certain capacities, you require a certain understanding of what's happening at the international level, what your obligations are, what your responsibilities are for responsible state behavior. So I think all of that fits very nicely into this idea of the confidence building measures that people are thinking about, the exercises that are being proposed under the points of contact directory, and so on. So all of those things essentially fit together into having a very practical way to bring a lot of these people, a lot of these countries into the conversation and have them become more actively involved. So I think that's something that we very much would like to be focusing on over the next year. And then, of course, the other big thing that will need to be talked a lot about over the next year is the future of the conversation. And so, we have those initial principles on a future regular institutional dialogue. I think now we need to elaborate on those principles. And I think, from the chair side of the podium, we're very much hopeful that we can we can have a consensus agreement on what the future mechanism will look like for this conversation. And we're very much trying to achieve that.
That's wonderful. And I think, I mean, let's say the takeaway point that I hear from you is, implementation by design in many ways, right? I mean, if the POC directory is a way of thinking about implementation as part of the design of the conversation of the UAWG, that is a useful way of going forward. But of course, I think there is a space potentially to think of how, different countries, and as you mentioned, one of the key takeaways is thinking about this checklist and thinking about how countries can actually bring their own experiences in implementing the existing norms. And I know that Singapore itself has also been working on that, so that's wonderful to hear. Right now, I think talking a lot about implementation kind of brings me to a very interesting sequencing to Carrie Ann. Carrie Ann Barrett, it's lovely to have you here and to be able to also have this kind of like going down one level to the regional kind of aspect of thinking about this discussion. So we've talked about like how at the international level there's this consensus documents that are produced, that there is a history of these norms, but what does that mean for Latin American and Caribbean countries? What does it mean for the Americas in terms of trying to implement those norms? But, in the more practical level, you that have been kind of working in let's say the front lines, being in different countries, actually speaking to government officials, what does responsible cyber behavior actually mean in practice? So if you could draw upon some of the experience that you have and talk about some of the challenges and maybe some of the realistic expectations of what practice means from the development of the region in terms of maturity. Could you elaborate on that, Carrie Ann?
Thanks so much, Louise and Tarusi, for having the OAS as a part of this discussion. I think just for everyone who's on the call, because you said it's a lot of researchers as well, I think context is important. When you think about anything that happens at the UN level, it's still individual states participating in that process and the need for them to then implement it at the national level when they get back home. I think from the regional perspective, it's really critical to think about what we have been doing as well to support those processes. So for example, OAS member states since 2004, we've had a national cybersecurity strategy that speaks and emphasizes the need to implement international norms and best practices at the national level. As far back as 1994, we started speaking about what it means to have a common understanding of confidence, security, and building measures. And that's one of the things that we consider in the implementation side of it. Another thing to take into context is that while the OAS had traditional measures as far back as 1994, as early as 2015, our first non-traditional measure spoke to the exchanging of information and adapting provisions on the domestic laws that relates to obtaining data and information, exchange experiences involving government service providers, users, others, prevention and management, and protection against cyber threats. So for us, it's important that as far back as then, our member states were actually thinking at a regional collective level as to what confidence building measures were needed to coordinate and cooperate. If you fast forward to 2017, we actually established our confidence building measures. So when you ask what does implementation mean for us at a regional level, we consider the execution or the cohesion of our region, thinking through that as a collective. So the working group that we have on confidence building measures, the first few measures that our member states were able to quickly decide on between 2017 and 2018, including designation of a national point of contact, ensuring that we can distinguish the policy level contacts from foreign affairs contacts, given that there may be different reasons for discussions. It also recognizes the need to develop and strengthen capacities through cyber diplomacy, training for diplomats, and cooperation of exchange on best practices. So from our perspective as to what does implementation look like, having our regional agreement on the need to build confidence through these measures is one way, recognizing that our measures are very practical and implementable. And the member states were able to also designate a secretariat to be able to support them in the implementation of these measures. As time kind of goes on, we also considered some of the other elements that are being discussed in terms of what is responsible cyber behavior, as you put it. And a part of the measures is actually recognizing the need for OAS member states to harmonize with the UN processes. Member states proposed as a CBM the implementation of the 11 the 11 voluntary non-binding norms, and that they also put in it, which I thought was pretty practical, that we would promote the reporting on these efforts, taking into account the National Implementation Survey, the promotion of dialogue with all stakeholders, including civil society, academia, private sector, technical community, among others. And it also, as a part of our practical measures, recognize that in order for us to speak that language and implement these norms at the international level and have responsible cyber behavior, we needed to have a shared national cyber incident severity schema. What does that mean? It means that member states at the national level will begin to identify what does an incident mean and what does that look like. On the practical side, a part of this really involves thinking through what does the Secretariat do to support our member states, because we do a lot of coordination. So when you think about how do we support our member states in being more responsible, we focus a lot on capacity building and training. Our cyber diplomacy courses do cover responsible state behavior, recognizing that we are a government entity, but we also have cyber diplomacy courses that we develop with non-governmental entities. So we do work closely with entities such as Diplo Foundation, ICT for Peace, where we're able to bring in the academia and the non-governmental perspective as well into those training. We coordinate really closely with other entities such as ICRC when we do these trainings. They've come in many times to speak about topical issues and practical application of those issues on human rights. We actually have a masterclass right now that focuses on international humanitarian rights law, taking into account that all of these things help states to be more responsible. And as you can imagine, our clientele is states. So we tend to focus on the governmental perspective while we coordinate with civil society and academia. I'll stop there just in case you have any other questions. And I hope that met the ask.
Absolutely. And I think, this provides an interesting overview of, what's the role of a regional, let's say, organization kind of facilitating that bridge between, let's say, sometimes multiple POCs at the national level. Of course, there is, the diplomatic kind of like representation and those that are more, let's say, directly engaged in, let's say, the CVM's working group within the OAS. But I think there are multiple other POCs, points of contact that you are continually engaging with, right? And I think the translation between why is it important to think about international norms and how that translates into a very practical element at the national level is an ongoing challenge. And definitely regional organizations have a role to play in this translation element. So I'd like to just follow up because one of the interesting bits is that we've talked a lot about capacity building and of course, to be a responsible actor, you really need to have the capacity to do so. But I wonder how much, and this goes back to your point on training, how much, taking a box of, let's say, having a national cert or having a national strategy is actually enhancing a country's way of being responsible. So I wonder, from a development perspective, and from practical elements of the mundane aspect of building a national cert, it's not just necessarily because you have a cert that you're responsible. So could you unpack on some of, let's say, the country-specific examples and what are, let's say, the barriers to advancing, responsibly as something that is embedded in the construction of these, let's say, centers or the construction or the development of a national strategy, right? Not just having a tick boxing exercise of developing a capacity as being responsible, but actually thinking about what are the barriers for countries in Latin America in achieving that in many ways and what are the, let's say, the strengths. So if you could potentially summarize or give one or two examples of countries in the region that have been doing that in your experience in, let's say, 2 minutes, that would be wonderful.
I think just thinking holistically as to how the region has increased its engagement in international dialogues, I think it's a critical thing. We've had over 500 member states actually nominate persons to be part of our cyber diplomacy course. I think that's them going beyond, because the courses could be offered and they don't participate, but they actually participate and continue to engage in those kind of capacity buildings. Back in 2014, we had only 5 national strategies, and now we have over 19 national strategies approved, and almost all of them have spoken to the need to engage on international cooperation in one way or the other, and they've addressed the issue of improving their cybercrime legislation. How member states have shown as well how they're engaging is we have our CSIRTs Americas network, which has grown as well to now have over 41 C-certs as a part of it. And we think that that's a very good demonstration of them moving from just nationally recognizing that a community is critical. And what many of them have recognized is that we also need to cooperate with the global. So we coordinate with FIRST as much as we can, recognizing that them moving it just from the national, as you said, into more the international space and coordinating on those topics is critical. One country that I could probably point out only because of just seeing the trajectory in terms of its engagement as a small island developing state is Antigua and Barbuda, for example. Antigua and Barbuda has established its national cert. One of their, the head of the C-cert has represented the country many occasions in all of the international dialogues, both the ad hoc committee and the open-ended working group. And to answer your question in terms of what are the barriers and the solutions is that a lot of that has been played by donors actually coming together and recognizing the need for these capacities and exposure. So for example, the participant from Antigua has benefited from the Canadian and the Australian UK initiative that speaks to the Women in Cyberspace fellowships. And when you think about how we have crossed that barrier, it's because we've tried to ensure that there is consistency in representation and capacity building. Many of our other countries, for example, Dominican Republic, the C-cert as well has been a very great player in terms of being part of the international dialogue, taking in the practical, technical perspective to the international diplomacy space and discussing issues at that level. So I know I had 2 minutes, so I hope that if anything, I think you could come back, yeah?
No, absolutely. I think that really responds. So I think we're going from, let's say, responsibility as a practice in terms of designing, the dialogue. I think what one takeaway that I have from your point, Carrie-Anne, is responsibility and kind of like trying to connect these different dimensions and knowing that they're very disparate and sometimes, right? I mean, I think it's a very high level. And when you look at the practice, I think there's something extra to that, and we'll continue to unpack that as we discuss over here. But right now I wanted to pass it over to Jamie. Jamie, we talked a lot about responsible state behavior, but definitely the other side of the corner, let's say, two sides of a very, close coin, as we've seen more recently, specifically, is looking at the private sector, right? I think it's undeniable, even when we talk about the implementation of the norms, that we're talking also about the role of the private sector in supporting many of the infrastructure development of different countries, right? So while previous examples really focus on government responsibility, as I've mentioned, the infrastructure, software, technology used by many of these governments really rely on the private sector and other stakeholders. So how have cybersecurity companies really kind of tried to enhance their own accountability and responsibility in providing, let's say, those services and solutions, right? Knowing that, many developed countries have really trouble to access sometimes those kinds of technology. So could you elaborate a bit on that? Are there any practical examples of, let's say, incident response where, this was successful in terms of like actually having an accountable framework and providing some services to very critical areas within a particular government?
Well, good afternoon, everyone. And I think, Louise, your question is certainly comes at a really timely moment, because I think there are certainly increasing calls for large, well-resourced organizations, the likes of Google, to take on a greater burden of, say, investment around cybersecurity. I mean, I think there is a good story to tell there, specifically on Google. I'm going to park that for the moment, because I want to focus on kind of broader issues. But I think if we look at, say, Jen Easterly, she put out a foreign affairs op-ed talking about this, the European Commission with the kind of first draft of the Cyber Resilience Act also, a lot of that is focusing on building kind of safer, more secure online ecosystems, and really with an actual emphasis of getting to the source of cyber insecurity, whether that's the code itself or the underlying infrastructure. And clearly, to your point, Louise, that clearly involves industry. So I think there's a big opportunity there for infrastructure providers to actually provide security at huge scale. And that means baking security into the design of products, but it also provides huge opportunities. So if we're talking about individuals and users moving to cloud, there's an opportunity there to not just ensure that the cloud itself is secure, but the security settings for users are, contain kind of secure default architecture that's going to make it kind of seamless, kind of make security more invisible, If I look at kind of Gmail, for instance, you've got kind of 1.8 billion Gmail users there that are relying on kind of AI systems to scan over kind of 300 billion email attachments every week, and that actually wipes out 99.9% of kind of malicious phishing. So there's that really kind of exciting opportunity that a lot of the infrastructure providers have. I think the critical question there is to ensure that a lot of that is then applied to responsible innovation going forward, and in areas like AI, like quantum computing, where clearly industry continues to have a significant influence on the makeup of those processes. And we're going to need secure frameworks around areas like AI to ensure that existing principles around secure architecture, that those are kind of imported into those systems. So I think a lot of that kind of starts off with this idea of security by design, which I think is a useful concept, but I think it's also one that people misunderstand, in that it is tempting to see this as a static exercise. The idea that industry gets it right once through secure by design and then can kind of relax. And actually that is just simply not the way that security works. And you need to complement security by design with what I call security by practice. And that is a recognition that, this is an iterative process. Sadly, it doesn't have a finish line. And actually a lot of the processes of security that industry needs to provide are continuous, continuous threat monitoring, threat hunting, vulnerability management. These are things that have a kind of constant cycle. So looking at the practices of these industry players is going to be really important, as well as that underlying architecture.
Yes, thank you, Jamie. I think you got me thinking a lot about this concept that you mentioned around responsible innovation, right? And from what I understood, what you're saying is that below that bigger umbrella, there is, security by design and security by practice. But I wonder, whenever, a company, and we could talk about Ukraine as well, right? When you have a huge migration to a particular cloud, of like highly sensitive, let's say, government data, or in other particular contexts that are not just like crisis related contexts, but that you have a huge reliance on, let's say, one or two companies in terms of government services. I mean, what is then the responsibility of companies, right? Is it just the government in taking a decision in terms of market, even of distributing, the different, providers or cloud providers, or you could think about other, types of, let's say, infrastructure that are not just related to cloud. But what would you say then responsible innovation means for countries that normally rely on huge outsourcing of their, let's say, infrastructure to some very few companies? So what would you say in terms of that, specifically when it comes to cloud, if you'd like to unpack that particular example?
Yeah, sure thing. So, I think that there's a few components there. I think a lot of what your question comes down to is data portability and the portability of systems. That am I going to be kind of locked into one provider or not? So I think what we want to see there, and certainly something, speaking to the kind of Google Cloud piece, certainly very committed to, is that kind of multi-cloud architecture. Actually, I think one of there are really exciting questions to ask about how countries can build resilience with clouds, and how that can work in a crisis situation. I think those are all questions we are asking right now, but we should also be asking questions about how easy is it to actually leave that cloud, move to a different cloud, operate kind of hybrid or multi-cloud strategies. So I think that's what we, that's where we kind of should be moving, is actually making sure that there isn't that lock-in, that the different infrastructure or cloud providers are going to actually be able to facilitate transformation, even if that means, say, leaving, or customers kind of leaving that their cloud as a provider, etc.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and just a quick follow-up. I mean, as I started to kind of point to, like, let's say, crises context, right? How does responsibility play into, decision to support or to abstain from supporting a particular country in a particular geopolitical situation? I think there's a lot of discussion with the big tech companies around what motivates them to actually, engage in responding to a particular, let's say, crisis. We can think about Ukraine, but we could think about other situations. But how does responsibility play in those contexts, and what's the decision making behind that? I mean, just 2 minutes tops for that answer, because I want to go very quickly to Alina.
Yeah, sure thing. Well, I think first of all, it's fortunate that a lot of the people making those decisions are hugely mission driven. A lot of these people come from backgrounds in government. National service is a huge value within the cybersecurity community. So I think we have a good starting point there. I think a lot of the support for crisis situations, hopefully people agree it's tech firms doing things for the right reasons. I think it is worth saying that it's got to be something that is sustainable. So that means, there's no, on the one hand, there's no shortage of goodwill from the private sector to support, but I think there also does need to be kind of clear and realistic understanding of under what conditions, what can be done in a kind of long-term effort. I think it may be a component that people don't think about as much is actually these kind of dual and competing ideas of empathy. On one hand, we want to look after the country or users in a crisis situation, and that might be doing incident response in Ukraine, for instance. But it also means actually looking after our own people, the actual people doing the incident response, making sure that often these people working in the tech sector are thrust into environments that are very political, quite literally war zones. So thinking about that is really important. And I think maybe the last thing about that assistance in crisis situations is that doesn't come out of nowhere, right? That needs to be based on some form of existing relationships. You ideally want to be building, or tech firms can kind of work together with governments to be building those relationships over many years. So if the worst should happen, there's a lot of those relationships and kind of contextual understanding already in place.
Yes, and I mean, there's a lot to be discussed, not just in terms of, you mentioned AI, you mentioned, responsible innovation, but I think, as companies become more and more enmeshed and involved in very geopolitical situations, right? I mean, what's the thinking around, being responsible in those kinds of situations? What is responsibility in conducting those kinds of responses? What are the models for doing that? But now I know we could just unpack that endlessly. That would be a webinar in itself, along with the previous kind of points discussed with the other speakers. But I want to pass it over to Alina. Because of course, at the heart of the global partnership is really thinking about what are the pathways for supporting a research-led and evidence-based understanding of what responsibility means, one that is also reflective of how different cultural perspectives factor into that. So Alina, academia and civil society are usually framed as the experts, and we heard that both in Matthew's and Carrie-Ann's kind of interventions to provide, let's say, a more research-led understanding of how governments can and private sector can engage or should operate when it comes to responsibility in cyberspace. But what are some of the practical examples that you would highlight of meaningful stakeholder inclusion in those processes? And it can be, cybersecurity specific or other areas that could potentially, influence, let's say, thinking about more inclusion and meaningful inclusion in responsible cyber behavior debates.
Well, first of all, Louise, hats off to you for convening this initiative. I think it's super important, and I'm looking forward to not only being a part of it, but more importantly, perhaps learning from everyone else involved in this network. Okay, not to sound too philosophical or anything, but I think it's important to unpack what meaningful inclusion means, right? And you sort of alluded to it in your introductory remarks by stating the phrase, diversity of views. And I think it's really important because we now have a whole range of check boxes to tick off. You have to have women in the room, you have to have civil society in the room, you have to have industry in the room. But if all these different actors from different backgrounds bring the same perspectives, then what's the point, right? And so I think this variety of insights and views that people bring, even if they sometimes may diverge from each other, is a very important piece of the conversation to be had. And going to your question about real examples, I think to me the most vivid one is the 2019 OEWG, when it was kind of in its initial stages. You saw a whole range of actors bringing very different and diverse perspectives to the discussion, which was frustrating in a way, because it seemed as if the conversation was going in all sorts of different tangents. I think you were there as well, Louise. But it really was quite enlightening in retrospect, because it just highlighted how these different backgrounds can really shape the discussion in ways that people from other backgrounds previously hadn't thought of. And I think that really provided a good starting point for how discussions in the OEWG later came to be shaped and are still being shaped. I think it's a little unfortunate that some of the representation has maybe dwindled a bit because of bureaucratic processes. But I think, and this is where the role of academia, civil society, but basically non-governmental organizations can play a huge role in putting the meaningful into the inclusion part of the equation. And this network is certainly very promising of that prospect. But I think the last point to what meaningful inclusion means is, if we take a step back, it's not just about participation, it's about access to participation as well. Okay, and that means language and the ability to communicate at these international forums. It means being understood in a way that international negotiators have been used to understanding certain terms and phrases. But it also means like very basic logistical things, like whether people are afforded visas on time, whether they can afford visas to travel, whether they can even afford to travel, and whether they can afford to pay for their accommodation to just be at the table. And so I think it's really important to take a step back and think about some of these fundamental components to what meaningful inclusion means.
Absolutely. And to your point, I think, you talked about like inclusion and the stakeholderization in many ways at the OEWG and let's say a more international level. But some of the things that, I don't know if you probably heard, I've heard before, is that, try to engage with your government at the national level, right? And how can we think about, and that's my question to you, how can researchers and civil society organizations that might find it more difficult to engage with their national government, right? Because as in many countries that it's actually, there's a closed door, and it's quite challenging for them to actually do that for various reasons. How can we then, how would you see that? How would you say would be a way of curbing or dealing or recognizing that challenge that exists, a difficulty of engaging with national governments to support, let's say, the international debate on this topic? So how would you say are strategies or opportunities for a research community that's normally, let's say, either sidetracked or has, very little, let's say, opportunity to engage in these debates, for them to also be included in that kind of reflection?
Yeah, that's certainly a challenge in a number of countries, particularly when governments and civil society actors are seen to be in opposition to each other. And maybe this reflects my own bias working in a think tank, having worked in a think tank for a long time. But I think in this case, and I've seen practical examples of this even at the regional level, where think tanks have brought people together, even if they don't agree with each other. Even government officials who don't usually speak to each other in more formalized settings can come together, sit across the table from each other, and they may, have their set talking points, even if they're a non-government representative. But in coffee breaks, at lunch, they're able to have a cigarette with each other, just have a drink with each other and talk very frankly. And some of that might not be immediately reflected in the discussions right after those breaks, but they carry that back with them in consideration. And I think think tanks at the track 1.5 level, bringing together both government officials as well as non-government officials, have played a role and can continue to play a role in that aspect by bringing together actors that would not ordinarily be in the same room together. Likewise, I think some of the capacity building courses that regional organizations, including Carrie Ann's, have put together, have surfaced voices that might not ordinarily have a seat at government tables, for example. And it's really, I think, at the wise discretion of some of these conveners to really reach out to stakeholders who might not ordinarily have this voice.
Absolutely. And my final question, and really quick, I would say, like, in a minute or like a tweet kind of answer, we need to be quite realistic. And I mean, this is a self-critique in a way of like thinking about, what's the role of academia, what's the role of the research community and all of this. And knowing that, researchers are not exempt from geopolitical spillovers, right? That relates a bit to my previous question. So how can we navigate a more adversarial thinking in academia while maintaining an evidence-based approach and a culturally sensitive outlook to responsibility in cyberspace? Again, knowing that, some stakeholders might have more difficulty of engaging, others might be, easier to engage. So how can we maintain this evidence-based in, let's say, the geopolitical spillovers across academia and be very realistic about that and frank about the conversations that we need to have?
Honestly, I think the majority of researchers, apart from in a few countries, maintain that evidence-based focus apart from geopolitical tensions, because they're not interested in being part of those geopolitical tensions. And so I think where that exists is where that sort of adversarial kind of nature comes in is really only in certain parts of the world. The majority part of the world, I think, has been conducting and will continue to conduct very narrow, but also so broad research on the issues that affect their country's interests, their region's interests best. That's kind of my tweet answer. But I think also, to just elaborate a little, there's also a responsibility for researchers to engage with the private sector. I want to get to Jamie's point about responsible innovation and tie this up to my earlier point about meaningful inclusion. In a lot of countries around the world, it's really the big technology companies that have a say in how the digital transformation is taking place. And I think it's really important to have the people who are going to be affected the most sit in on those conversations and offer their thoughts in a way that they understand best.
That's great, Alina. And I'd like to pass it over to now, I know that we're almost on time, so I really appreciate all of the speakers for agreeing for us to have, at least an extra couple of minutes. And also our team over here, the events team, for some extra questions. So I'd like to pass it over and I'll just open up, and maybe for the ones that are not directed, I'll just open up for all of you to reflect on it. So I'd like to start off with a question from Sharif. Hashem, hi Sharif, great to see you here. So he's asking, thanks for sharing the progress of the OAWG with the upcoming cyber capacity building roundtable planned for May 2024. I guess his question is if it's open to non-governmental stakeholders from industry and academia. So Matthew, maybe that's one that's more directed towards you. Do you want to comment on that?
Then the answer to that is yes. And we would very much welcome participation from everyone, and we, especially from across the world, from different regions. So yes.
Is there already an expectation? I mean, that's my follow-up to that. Is there already an expectation of how the process will be for different, let's say, interested parties to demonstrate their willingness to participate, or is that still being discussed?
We're still at the very early stages of planning it. So we'll be sending out invitations at some point, and also, but feel free, if anyone is interested, feel free to get in touch with me, and also just to discuss the OAWG more broadly. Our door in the chair's office is always open, so we're very happy to engage. Thank you.
Wonderful, Matthew. Now a question from Richard Harris. Also great to see you over here. Do the panel, and I think this question kind of goes maybe to Jamie, Matthew, but others, please feel free to comment on that because it is the hot topic of the day, I'd say. So he's asking, do panelists believe that we need new norms for AI, or could approaches to implementing current norms address responsible use of AI? And I think this is a very specific intersection, right, between AI and cybersecurity, and knowing which dimensions of AI and cybersecurity. I think ARIA formula that happened, and this is me winking to you, Matthew, the ARIA formula that happened on the Security Council with regards to AI and security could be an interesting point there. But I would just like to open up to maybe Jamie, maybe Matthew, and whichever other speakers would like to chime in.
I think my view would be yes and no. I think a part of securing AI is actually expanding a lot of the strong security foundations we already have identified to that AI ecosystem. And that's reasonably straightforward. It's about the architecture, so kind of secure by default principles we've already discussed. But I think there's also needs to be a recognition on the fact that some of the threats posed to AI look quite different. If we think of some of the attack scenarios, whether that's prompt injections, data poisoning, model stealing, they look potentially quite different to a traditional network intrusion. You know, there's a big questions of what incident response might look like, what observables and infrastructure can we look at in an environment when we're talking about something like data poisoning. It's a slightly different issue. So I think we do need to expand and understand those sorts of attack scenarios, and whether that's going to need, whether that's new security policy or new ways of thinking about security measures at the kind of network defense level.
Anyone else would like to comment on that?
Yeah, I'll take a stab at this. So I think there's a big conversation at the UN now going on about AI. And so there's AI specifically in the area of cybersecurity. And then for that, you then can split it into two also, right? You have security for AI, which is, you know, what Jamie was talking about. So all the vulnerabilities of AI prompt injection and so on. And then you have the other side of the coin, which is AI for security. So are we using AI systems to either to leverage AI to make our systems safer, or are the bad actors using AI to exploit vulnerabilities in a faster way or better way? So that's one section, and we're having a very preliminary discussion of it in the open-ended working group yet. I think it's still at the stage where people are trying to feel their way around it, and I don't think there's a very clear understanding yet of what we need to do. So I think it's a very nascent conversation. So that's the sort of cybersecurity aspect. And then you have the broader aspect of AI at the UN, where people are talking about standards, best practices, processes. And this is also happening at the international level elsewhere. There's the G7 is talking about the Hiroshima standards, the UNESCO standards, that's the Global Partnership for AI. And so I think there is that understanding that there needs to be some sort of understanding, whether it's in the form of norms or whether it's in the form of sort of looser best practices or recommendations. I think that's a conversation that's very much being had at the UN, and that's now the Secretary General's just convened a high-level advisory board on AI, and that's definitely one of the things that they'll be thinking about. There's also a global digital compact negotiation going on. And that's one of the things it's meant to look at is also AI. So I think there are all these different conversations going on, and in a way it's a sort of technical esoteric division, but that's sort of where we are. And
I'd like to follow up on that. I mean, perhaps shifting a bit to Carrie-Anne and making use of the AI word here for us, and Alina. Carrie-Anne, I mean, when thinking about this intersection between AI and cybersecurity, I think when we look at developing country context, I mean, how much of it is actually palpable or used as like a consolidated agenda? Or when it comes to cybersecurity, I mean, we're looking at very specific kinds of applications of AI, right? I mean, it's a very limited way of thinking about cybersecurity. So thinking about AI, an application. Are we really focusing on a hyperbole when the practice of most of these countries when it comes to AI is, let's say triage, using AI for triaging incidents and doing incident response, or helping out in going through threads of threat intelligence, right? So, I mean, Carrie-Anne, could you reflect on that? I mean, from a practice perspective, I mean, what is the reality on the ground when it comes to that?
I think one of the reality, like just to roll right into it, is that many of our member states are using AI already in out-of-the-box solutions from persons that they purchase, either incident handling, monitoring for threats. A lot of AI is already built into it. one of the things as a program that we're thinking to try and distinguish is AI for cybersecurity. So looking at the fact that competencies are small, there's limitations in human resources. So seeing how AI can be used to support cybersecurity efforts, as opposed to focusing on cybersecurity for AI, because the AI is really built into whatever product, cloud sourcing, whatever it is that our member states are purchasing, the AI is already built in. So I think really being able to distinguish from a capacity perspective, artificial intelligence for cybersecurity is one of the things that we think is more critical.
Excellent. I don't know, Adelina, if you have any comments on that. Otherwise, I'll go to the next question. All good, great. Well, let's say the golden ticket question, Matthew, that hasn't come up. I didn't want to ask that question, but someone asked, which is with regards to the future of negotiations and especially the relationship between the OEWG and the POA as it goes forward. I think this is another question from Sharif. Reflecting on what's the perceived relationship between both, if it's and I'll build on top of that, whether it's contradictory, whether there's some space for continuity given the rising tensions within the OEWG, and whether it's expected to find more synergies, or what are we looking at in terms of the OEWG and the POA going forward.
My light seems to have gone off. Okay. I think there is broad agreement amongst all delegations that it's helpful and productive to discuss the POA within the OEWG, and I mean we've been doing that as part of a broader discussion of regular institutional dialogue. We've had that discussion ever since the start of this OEWG, and actually it's a discussion that was being had even in the previous OEWG. So I think there's that understanding that this is something that the OEWG does discuss, and I think we have been in a sense deepening that discussion. I mean, I can't speak for the POA co-sponsors as to what the broader thinking is, but I think from our perspective we're very we've been very ready to work with them and to work with everyone else as well who has different ideas to have these discussions within the OEWG. And I think right now there is if you look at the latest thinking on the POA again, I mean I don't presume to speak on behalf of them, but I think if you look at the latest thinking on the POA, it's very much clear that the POA is a proposal for what happens after the OEWG. It's a proposal for essentially the next step. So then it very much makes sense to be discussing that next step now within the OEWG, and there's no to answer your question, Louise, I don't think there's any inherent contradiction there, because it's not something that's meant to contradict or compete. It's something that will happen after that. As to whether that is the final eventual outcome that all states can get behind, I think that's an open question. That's very much work in progress and work to do for the POA co-sponsors to convince everyone, especially the skeptics, that this is the right thing to do as the next process. And so that's very much a conversation that will be playing out, I think, over the next year especially.
Interesting. I think we could definitely unpack at that as well, but I'd like to close off with a question / comment from Kubo Machak that has posted here for us, and I think it's something that also cuts across our different, let's say, positionalities. So I'll just read it really quickly, because I think it's quite important to voice his thinking over here. So he said that he fully agrees with you, Carrie-Anne, that it's important. That is an important point, that whatever states agree at the global level still has to be implemented at the regional and domestic level. But he would suggest that an important reverse process is also underway, where intrastate discussions and coordination are essential for the identification of common understandings at the international level, right? So the reverse, as he mentioned, as an international lawyer, he sees this process as particularly trend of adoption of national positions on international law as it applies to cyber operations. So his question is, what can we do to encourage more states to develop such positions and to support the internal discussions necessary to do so? So positions on how international law is applicable to cyber operations. How can different stakeholder groups support those processes and encourage as well? So if it makes sense, because I'd like to also hear from Alina. Alina, do you want to reflect a bit on that, and especially what the research community can also do to kind of support, or has been doing to support those kinds of reflections?
Yeah, maybe I can try to answer Kubo's question in two parts. I think the first part is a matter of both capacity and political will. Capacity because there are obviously resource constraints, but particularly in terms of personnel hours for many countries in really engaging in these issues, because there has to be awareness first about how some of these international law issues will affect these countries if they're not already doing so. And then the other part of the equation, political will, is, I think the reality is that there are many countries who feel uncomfortable about publishing national positions on this issue for various reasons. And one of those reasons is especially because they don't have the capacity, and so they don't want to reveal what they see to be as a weakness for the whole world to see. So I think we have to be very realistic about expectations for countries that feel that they're not at capacity to do so.
Maybe that's a nice segue, and I'll prompt Carrie Ann, because I know that one of the latest kind of positions that came out was from Costa Rica. So Carrie Ann, how would you reflect on that particular question of futurely supporting more states to be more transparent and open about their views on how international law applies to cyber operations?
I think I would probably lean towards the report that Duncan Hollis had produced in 2018, because our International Juridical Committee is the expert on international law. Our cybersecurity program opines to them. And I think continued work on that is important. And I think what Alina says in terms of the level of comfort to be able to make that public declaration is critical. And it's something that even as SICTE, which is the Inter-American Committee Against Terrorism, where our program sits, it's not something we could speak about as well either. A decision on a public declaration as a state on how they view international applicability of international law to cyberspace is really something that is at their sovereign level. So what I would probably lean towards is, it's clear from the 2018 report that Duncan would have published that member states are talking about it. And I think that's a good starting point, that member states do recognize that they need to have a discussion around it, and there is need to have some position on it. Some have put that in their national cybersecurity strategies, so may not have been something published as a statement per se, but in their national cybersecurity strategy, they have recognized it as well. So I think that's a tier deeper that you could look into. But I'll probably opine as well, as I said, to the Interjuridical Committee for any response on that. And I would support Alina's position and how she articulated it.
Jamie and Matthew, do you have any comments on that particular question before we close?
I'm not an international law guy, so probably don't have much perspective there. But what I would say is, threat landscapes look very different in different regions. I think we often assume that states like Russia, etc., are conducting these campaigns across the globe, but actually we often see that cyber conflict is very regionalized. A lot of the cyber activity that we see is organized countries targeting within their near abroad. So I think there's clearly a huge amount of value of kind of regional cooperation or regional focus, figuring out solutions based on regional challenges, regional threats. So I think that is something that is a little bit neglected at the moment.
Matthew?
Yeah, I think I'll just quickly say that I fully agree with Kubo's point about this reverse process. And I mean, yeah, and you see it across all pillars, right? I think particularly, where we've really seen that work very well has been with the points of contact directory, where you had all these regional efforts, and then eventually it what was learned from there, what was coordinated there, eventually culminated in what we have at the global level now. In terms of how can we encourage states to be doing these things on international law? I think one of the things that's been in multiple OEWG reports this time around, and the previous time as well, has been a call for more capacity building in the area of international law. And I think that's important because, I mean, as you see this very much in the international law discussions at OEWG, where you have a small group of countries who have very good lawyers, have thought these issues through, and very much want to move forward. And they have different ideas how they want to move forward, but these various countries want to move forward. And then you have everyone else who is still, in a way, grappling with these issues and thinking about it. And I think for these countries that want to advance the discussions forward quickly, I think an important thing to do also is to think about capacity building, think about how to bring everyone up to that level of understanding. And then once we're there, we can probably then have this very comprehensive and deep discussion on common understandings that's truly a universal discussion.
Absolutely, and I would like to just close off because we have exceeded our time, and I really thank you all for also having the flexibility to do so. But I'd just like to thank you all. Thank you all for a very interesting discussion. I think it's no easy task to talk about responsible cyber behavior, which is a very broad concept, and trying to pin down the different, let's say, perspectives from each stakeholder group here, but also, let's say, at the international and national and regional levels, right? So thanks for accepting that challenge. I think we have a huge challenge ahead of us and an exciting road ahead also to think about what is a research agenda across different regions. How do we unpack not just that international level, but also domestic accountability measures that are have already been set in place by many of these countries, but also at the operational level, which we didn't discuss that much over here, of thinking about the responsible use of technology and the responsible, conducting of operations, right? I think we need to be realistic that many countries will conduct cyber operations, but that nonetheless means that they need to be accountable and transparent and to some degree in doing so. So I think this is just a start of multiple conversations that we'll have. Thanks a lot, Carrie Ann, Elena, Jamie, Matthew, our RUSI events team for also bearing with us exceeding our time, and all of our attendees online. Please stay tuned to the Global Partnership for Responsible Cyber Behavior. Next Monday, we'll have an event co-organized with Florida International University on capacity building in Latin America, unpacking a bit some of the experiences of the countries there and also countries that have been supporting the development of different initiatives there. So please stay tuned.